Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Barbarian and this is of course Victoria 3's 9th Dev Diary. Today we're going to be talking about national markets, but just as promised in the last video. Today we're going to also cover the community discussion about the last Dev Diary, so that is institutions. We're going to cover every single dev response left on that topic, and we're also going to cover the idea of, hey, you know, I tweeted Martin Anwar tweeted back. What does it mean? There was something that I, of course, tweeted him about. I do that usually every week. And this week, or rather last week, I tweeted him about the topic of administrative efficiency on the state level. We're going to get into all of that. I just want to say, if you want to skip that, if you're not interested in community feedback or in the dev responses, which is understandable, hey, to each their own, right? You can skip ahead. There will be chapters in this video. You can just go straight to the Dev Diary itself. If you are interested in participating in this discussion, whether it is about this week's Dev Diary or last week's Dev Diary, feel free to leave a comment. Again, I have 29 comments, I believe, here today just for institutions. That's a lot of comments, so there's a high chance that I will include you as well. For anybody that wasn't included, don't feel bad about it. You know, hey, it just doesn't... 29 is already a pretty high number, I would say. Now, let's jump into this one. Regarding the state efficiency, could it be that there's a system where it gets debuffs depending upon how acceptable the culture and possibly the religion is to the nation, similar to how it is in other PDX titles, but I am predominantly thinking of the Imperator system. So, I, first of all, very much agree. I think this is a really good point. We have seen that cultural discrimination to a certain degree exists. I have to assume religious discrimination also exists, seeing as you can be a very religious nation, but being a religious nation doesn't mean that you accept all religious pops, right? They have to be of your religion, of course. Now, I do think this is the case. How extensive, how deep, and how involved it is a different question. Honestly, I can't answer it. I don't know any more than any of you do, and I just want to say, I don't just say that, I wish I had played, like, 800 hours of the game already, but the way it stands at the moment, I have to say that basically, if I talk about topics, if I speculate about topics, you can always assume I don't know any more than you do, because I'm not going to be breaking any NDAs. So silence from my side is more indicative commonly. Now, with that being said, I think that this should be an important notion, but I also want to highlight that I don't think we are looking at an Imperator Rome culture system here, although that is of course rather interesting because Imperator Rome actually has a lot of minority rights topics in it. But with Wiz's background, I think that thinking Stellaris, which is not that difficult from that different from the Imperator Rome system, but I think that Stellaris is the better sort of anchor point if we want to see what the inspiration looks like. Honestly, I don't know yet. I mean, the entire accepted cultures thing is something that they could have just translated one-to-one from Victoria 2. I mean, it wouldn't be that bad. I think that system worked, but at the same time, they could have also expanded on it like crazy, and we just don't know about it. So yes, I agree. I hope that this is the case, but whether it is, I have no idea. I think laws not being flat upgrades is one of the best changes in Victoria 3, and it allows for a bit of historical roleplay, having secular schools as France and religious schools as Austria, just for an example. Yeah, and most importantly, and I think this is very vital, we have a situation now here where I can actually play Religious Nation and not necessarily fall behind. I mean, we had so many situations where you had this reactionary sort of roleplay that somebody wanted to do. They wanted to, I don't know, remain a constitutional or even an absolute monarchy for the entirety of the game. And that quickly becomes very, very difficult because you will have militancy rise like crazy unless you pass social reforms. And you will be in a position where if you pass these reforms, then you just have a lot of consciousness, making it so that these people all of a sudden don't vote reactionary anymore, or they want to vote really desperately, that sort of stuff. And I think that that can be something that is, of course, pressure that we should acknowledge that historically existed and that should be implemented in the game. But you can have, and this is always the framing used here, the benevolent monarch, right? That says, I want to have a nation that is very healthy and that is very active, but I'm on top of it. And the example of the schools here makes it so that you can heavily invest in healthcare or schools, but it can be your flavor, right? It can be the flavor that you want for your state, because that is what sort of society you want to have in your roleplay playthrough. So I completely agree. I think this is a change significantly for the better, not just in roleplaying, but also in the fact that you can do things without saying, hey, this just locks me into a certain path now. I am surprised there were no mentions of corruption. This could add a realistic level of complexity and challenge. For example, if your bureaucrats are underpaid, if they dislike your government, they might take some of the taxes for themselves or ruin your bureaucratic efficiency. Then you'd be stuck having to choose between maintaining your bureaucracy despite this or get rid of it with a challenge that accompanies it. It could also create events where interest groups that lean towards anarchism or decentralization are favored by your population, ruining years of trying to build up a centralized national government and institutions. Anyway, very stoked for this game either way. So this is an interesting point. I think corruption in general goes hand in hand with a question that I had for Wiz when it comes to the topic of state modifiers, right? Do we have the state as something, or the states, or the individual subsections of a nation? Do we have these states with any meaningful impact on the bureaucratic authority, or is it all on a central level? I do think when it comes to corruption, we can say, now whether that is the ideal solution, I don't know. I think abstraction is very necessary, but, you know, it's always one of those things, you can't really influence it here at this point, you can't really feel it. You could say, if your administration is lower, so if your bureaucracy is lower than the bureaucracy points required, that can be viewed as corruption, right? It can be viewed as people saying, hey, I don't like this work, I'm being underpaid, or maybe I'm in a situation where nobody notices if I do certain things, you know, take some money out of the state funds. On a technical level, I would argue that we can say that the tax money that is squandered by virtue of bureaucracy being too low isn't squandered. I don't know whether there will be an actual mechanism where, you know, if this tax money is squandered, it is actually paid to a certain degree, but goes to bureaucrats, which would be interesting, because that could make it so that these bureaucrats would then have more funds, which could make it so that they are wealthier, despite, of course, technically being underpaid, and they could even invest into companies, for example. They could level up, quote-unquote, to capitalists and so on. I think it would be interesting. I would be interested in seeing that. Whether that is actually in the game, I am not sure. Now, the other topic of corruption, of course, is that this could be a state topic. What I explained just now is basically the integration of corruption into the existing nationwide system. But when it comes to the state topic, let's debate that when we get to one of the later comments and to Martin Anwar. But yeah, in general, I think that corruption could be displayed in a more direct way, but I think you could even say that it is abstracted into the bureaucracy tax loss. I don't think a mechanic has to necessarily be relatable to be fun. The questions are is the mechanic understandable and intuitive, and does the mechanic enhance an enjoyable element of the game? I don't think managing my nation's navy is fun or relatable, but I think it enhances my enjoyment of the challenge the game presents. So, the way I feel about this is, yes, I basically just used bad phrasing. This was essentially also something, or the point that I was trying to make, where when I said relatable, what I really meant was the idea that you understand what the mechanism behind it is. I think there are mechanics, for example in EO4, where you fundamentally say, hey, we have a mechanic here, and the mechanic works on a mechanical level, but does it make sense? Like, is this something that I can envision happening in real life? You know, again, with the bird points, technically speaking, we can argue that the bird points signify a certain amount of bureaucracy, a certain amount of administration, and that is why they are related to, for example, the navies, right? I do think that what I personally prefer is a more direct relationship between these things, and that is what I phrased as relatable. I did mean understandable. So yeah, no, I generally agree. Except I think managing a navy can be fun. In most strategy games, it just kind of isn't. But yeah, I think that 100% administrative efficiency likely won't mean you get 100% of everything possible, but instead, you get 100% of what can be extracted from law-abiding citizens. It doesn't matter how many bureaucrats you have, if people are dodging your draft or using tax havens, then there's nothing they can do to get access to those troops or taxes. Most likely, instead of those things decreasing max or effective administrative efficiency, they just apply a malus to the base amount before applying administrative efficiency. Put another way, it is possible for your bureaucrats to be working at 100% efficiency, but get very little from the state, with the reason being that the tool to deal with the deficit isn't bureaucrats, but a different arm of the government. So basically, this is sort of feeding into the idea that you have state modifiers there. Yeah. I personally don't disagree. You could have a perfect administrative efficiency and yet have a state where things aren't rolling well, you know, where things aren't settled yet, where, I mean, you would know it as, for example, in CK3 in control, you can have a perfect state, but, you know, in this specific location, things aren't going that well, and it might even not be related to the bureaucracy at all. I do think, though, that what we have to consider is, What Victoria 3 tries to do a lot, from what we have seen so far, is go in and basically say, hey, we want to have a direct connection here, we want it to be recognizable what is going on here, and how you can change it. So how you can get more funds, how you can get more resources from this particular location, from other locations, from a section of a population, and so on and so forth. And I think if you have a situation where bureaucracy is responsible for example, the tax income, to a large degree, you know, when it comes to the taxes that you collect, and you bring in different elements of that, it can lead to a situation where it kind of washes out. Bureaucracy and all the other effects on their own become much less interesting, much less involved, making it so that people generally ignore it. We have that, for example, with in CK3, a very good example for this, and it saddens me, but in CK3 a very good example of this is Realm Authority versus, or rather, combined with vassal contracts. Technically speaking, both of these things manage how many levies and how much money you get from your vassals. But since one of them is much easier to manage, people just ignore changing vassal contracts. And that leads to a situation where vassal contracts exist as a mechanic, but nobody touches them because they're much more difficult to handle compared to saying, hey, I'm going from Realm Authority 2 to Realm Authority 3. I'm not saying that is a necessary effect. I think that that can be circumvented. I think that if you develop the systems well enough, then people will still interact with both of them. But a worry of mine is that if you mix it up too much, it's easily botched, right? I'm not saying it has to be botched, and I'm not saying at all they shouldn't be ambitious and try to connect these mechanics. For example, I don't know, the military arm, you know, in a location, and the administrative efficiency working together to actually get you the 100% thing that you can get there in terms of payout. Be it manpower, be it money. I'm just saying this is easy to mix up, but I do think they should be ambitious about this. They should try it out. Good comment. Regarding the colonial affairs, does the type you choose apply to all of your colonies? Because historically, large empires often had several types of colonies: settler, exploitation, protectorates, trade outposts, etc. at the same time. So whilst it makes sense for the British to encourage settlement in Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, and to a lesser extent South Africa, it wouldn't make sense to do it for India at the same time. Somebody commented underneath this that India was also attempted to receive British settlement on a large scale, but of course India has a huge population, making it so that that wasn't really viable. I don't think that this distinction is currently in the game. I fundamentally haven't seen that. What they have depicted colonies at so far is primarily saying, hey, colonies give you resources and they buy resources, and that is big. So they primarily focus on the resource game on that topic. You can improve colonial migration pool, but that will, from what we've seen so far, impact every single colony. I think this could be cool. I don't think it's going to be in the game. I don't think that is going to be in the game. I mean, this distinction wasn't in the game in Victoria 2, and that is not an excuse. Victoria 2 was developed in one game and then received a 2 DLC. So very short development cycle, right? And you want to top that, basically. I am not sure. I don't think we're going to see that in the game. I do think it deserves being in the game, though. Now, next up, I hope they change the icons for institutional levels in the final product. Having one icon is boring, and it makes it hard to tell at a glance what each new institution level represents. Yeah, fair enough. You have to see that I'm one of the people, I don't mention that because I'm not a very visually inspired person. I like maps a lot, but when it comes to interfaces, I primarily look at, is this wasting space? Is this showing me all the options that I need? But it's true. Visually speaking, this can be improved. There should be more art. There should be more general visibility just in the icons. I completely agree. Again, I don't look for that personally, but I think that's a good comment. I'm so glad they are adding something to counter rebellious activities. I think we can agree how rebellions and revolutions were poorly handled in Victoria 2. It was garbage. Rebellions, revolutions, and the factions that precede them in Victoria 2, they're basically worse versions to a large degree, I think, than EU4 rebels. EU4 rebels often, once they rebel, actually end in your death, though, so that is even primarily worse. In Victoria 2, it can just change your government, which is great. I think that is a cool idea. We don't know anything about this yet. I very much hope, sincerely, now that we have people that are attached to interest groups, that we can actually then see these interest groups commit to certain acts, like, hey, we really want to achieve X, or we really want to achieve Y, and you're not giving us a parliamentary way, so we're going to do it there. Because that means that you can have a genuine dialogue, that you can genuinely see who this person is that is leading them, and how you could influence them, right? I think, or rather I hope, that they work a lot with that, rather than just, hey, it's just look at the time, it's another anarcho-liberal uprising. The Jacobins are back. You know, I think that we are way past that. I think this is 2021, and I don't like invoking the year as like an argument of authority, but the truth is that grand strategy gaming has moved on, or should be moving on, from this level of interaction. I mean, CK2 had amazing mods like CK2 Plus and HIP that made it so that you could actually interact with the factions in your realm by meeting them in their faction meeting, by making them promises, and by weakening their leaders, for example. I think that is something that we need to do here as well. Where we go in and basically say, hey, this comes directly from society, and it should interact through it with society. So yeah, big point. I hope we're going to learn about revolutions sooner rather than later, because that is a very important topic. I feel like it should be the state by state how effective institutions are. Even today, different states have different levels of institutions within the same nation. Some states might have higher levels of law enforcement, but lower levels of education than others. I also feel that grouping together doctors, teachers, and cops under bureaucrats might make figuring out which IG they follow either unrealistic or hard to figure out. I also wonder who treats your population in which buildings if healthcare is private, same for education. So, what needs to be, I think, established on the Victoria 2 subgenre level is that Victoria games have never really, it coincides with it, but they have never really depicted just the job of a population. It does correlate with that, of course, a lot. I don't say anything against that. Laborers are literally laborers, but there's laborers that are metal workers, that are woodworkers, that are construction workers, and so on and so forth. What it really depicts is just this class, this general segment of people, this strata. And while I can agree that, so I agree with the first part basically of the statement. The second part, I think, is not the core vision of Victoria as a series. That doesn't mean it's bad. I just think that is not something that we should ever expect. They already introduced basically, right, that one pop can have different, or one pop has one leaning, but all of these people coming together, you can also break it down basically to a different interest group. You know, if you break it down, it's either 15% of this pop or 15 people, right? That is something that you can do and that you're encouraged to do, and they have a certain leaning. I think that bureaucrats will still split in a very significant manner, because interest groups have a certain percentage chance to pull a pop in, right, to make them interested in that. I just think that it happens on a more generalized group of people level, rather than the individual that is a teacher, a doctor, or a cop. Effectively, it doesn't really make a difference. I can absolutely see a mod that actually splits people by their genuine jobs. I'm just not sure that it would work. I would love to see it. But I don't think that this will ever be in a vanilla game in Victoria. Now, when it comes to the first one, that's a big topic that's going to come up later as well with Wiz's comment. I just want to highlight that. We're going to address it later. But the topic of state-by-state effective institutions, yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And I know that this is also on the mind of the devs. But let's get to that in a bit. I would prefer if infrastructure and distance from bureaucratic centers had an effect on efficiency, but it's not the end of the world if not. Good comment. Keep that in mind. I definitely like institutions. They may actually be my favorite feature of the game so far. I just really like how they make the laws feel so much more concrete. Now you actually have laws that affect specific institutions, which give specific effects and can themselves be expanded or reduced. It gives an extra layer of complexity, laws and institutions, but it also gives an extra layer of realism in that it makes the whole thing more concrete, more understandable, less abstract, and I really appreciate that in a grand strategy game. Yeah, I agree. And I want to clarify that as well. If you enjoy EU4, you should enjoy EU4. EU4 is a great board game, and this is not an... Oh my god. That just sounded like, it's a great board game, but a grand strategy game. Listen, what I mean is, there's different flavors, and there's always going to be content in the world, whether it's gaming, whether it's entertainment, whether it's jobs, that are not made for you. That just aren't for you, right? And EU4 isn't for me, but I can accept that its abstraction works in its own mechanical systems. I just prefer that abstraction to not be in the games that I like. And I think this is exactly how I feel on this topic as well. I think institutions develop something further that worked fairly well in Victoria 2 and give it more range. And I think that is a really good decision right there. Fewer positions on the sliders makes way more sense. The idea that you can just minutely fine-tune your budget at any time in Victoria 2 was super unrealistic, yes. 100% completely unrealistic. That, oh, my budget today is down, I'm gonna tweak my income. Not how it works. Changing tax reforms, getting more budget, it takes time, it's intense, you know, because you need to debate it, and it doesn't happen immediately either way. I also, again, and I've made this case many times, so I'm not going to do that in the extended variant here, I personally fundamentally think that full sliders, so a genuine full slider, is just one right option and then 99% trap options. And that's just really bad. So besides the fact that fundamentally it doesn't work that way, you can't just change the taxes at any given moment to an insane, to a lunatic style degree, I also think that the trap options are just bad design. But hey, sliders were so common in the early grand strategy games. It was actually crazy. I mean, EU did it in a different style, right? Where you could, I mean, hey, Hearts of Iron 2 did it in a different style. Jesus, oh my god, it was so good. You had these sliders for political leanings, and they would influence certain modifiers in your game, you know, whether you were paternalistic or democratic, whether you were right or left on the economic scale, etc., etc. And basically, you could move them, I think, once a year. It could have been once every 6 months, I can't remember. But those sliders were different. I can't criticize those as much as I can criticize the one in Victoria 2, because they're just bad. I get what you're going for with the EU4 mana stuff, though there is money for building ships and armies and the like. I have to defend the game. I have 1814, nice number by the way. That's Napoleon. Hours in a little bit. Victoria 3 will probably challenge EU4 in hours within a few years. I am not saying, and I want to stress this, EU4 is a bad game. EU4 is a bad game for me. I think the mana stuff on a mechanical level works wonders. I think it makes for a great board game experience. It's just really not what I'm looking for. You gotta listen, the older you get, and I'm already like 60, the older you get, the more you realize that like live and let live really applies. I trash talk EU4 a lot, but it comes from my point of view, right? It's not me saying you better not enjoy that game. I'm just hoping the game comes with a good tutorial because it looks so interesting, but damn, it looks very complex for my 2 brain cells. So I've thought about this a lot recently. I think Victoria 3 will be much more accessible than Victoria 2, which is not hard. But I also think that it will not be a CK3 situation. I think that is impossible. I think the focus of the games is too different. I think the focus of Victoria 3 is too clearly on numbers. And that's fine. I do think they're going to have a good tutorial. I think they've been really, really good about this with Victoria, with CK3. I see no reason that they would interrupt that all of a sudden and go, nah, you know what? Let's just ruin it again. I believe, basically. I believe. A post office telecom institution seems like a strange absence from the institution list, but perhaps that is directly covered by buildings, or might have been as redundant, as I imagine much of the bureaucratic building abstraction could be thought of as post office and telegram stations, and any institution focused on communication would mainly provide bonuses to your bureaucracy. So I asked, hey, do you have any ideas what more institutions there could be? And I love this comment so much, because it basically says this could be there, but also I think it's already accounted for. And I feel the same way. I think that the infrastructure in general that you can build is basically also the idea of a post office system, of a telecom system, and so on and so forth. It partially will be represented in bureaucracy by using telephones, but I think that the heavy lifting here of this sort of topic is just done with the idea of infrastructure, because that influences your market access, that influences how fast people can traverse, and so on and so forth. What I really like about the idea of bureaucracy is that it is effort and it is payoff. You can put effort into building up your bureaucracy by spending money, by building buildings, by making sure you have enough of the right types of pops, and then the moment you unexpectedly need extra bureaucracy, you can just say click and it gives you a positive outcome. Whereas if you didn't put the effort to build up your bureaucracy, you're left with a difficult choice of what to get rid of. Both scenarios are interesting, and the first scenario is very rewarding, much more so than just picking the advisor, which gives you more points, and then watching the number tick up automatically. See, the interesting thing, this is going to be a really off-topic sort of tangent. The interesting thing is that, in effect, these two mechanics are not different. These two mechanics are the same. If you build up to have bureaucracy that you then use later, that's the same thing as waiting for a number to tick up and then use that number. I'm just saying mechanically speaking, okay? But there is, and this was unloaded. This was uncharged, or really came out in a very charged fashion. This was observed very vividly. I think Remy made that video. Remy Down Under. When Imperator Rome came out, Imperator Rome heavily relied on the board game aspect of saying things tick up and then I use them. Right? And that was heavily criticized. Now I understand that, and I think that is a really good point, because it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel dynamic, it doesn't feel interactive. But mechanically speaking, these things are the same. And I think this is a really good showcase of how a certain presentation of mechanics does make a huge difference. A huge difference, a massive difference. Let's be real here. To a certain degree, I think the capacities aren't that different from actually having a full-on supply. So like a full, a stockpile of points, for example, because you still plan ahead. In EU4, you plan ahead and say, I need X points to then get this tech in this certain moment. In this one, you say, I'm going to go for this institution later on, so I need these points, so I'm going to build this up right now, right? The difference isn't that big on a mechanical level, but on a perception level, it's huge, and I think that matters. I think this is a really good lesson that they forcibly had to learn with Imperator Rome. I think, yeah, it's basically, this comment is basically saying these mechanics are the same, but they certainly don't feel the same. And I can, I really just want to highlight this because I think it's a really important point for basic game design in Grand Strategy. What worries me about institutions running on bureaucracy is the lack of differentiation. Schools in the capital run on paper, which is fine. Police stations in a freshly incorporated, highly discontent state also run on paper and not guns. Nor does it seem like the health system consumes any specific medicine goods. Yeah, I actually agree. I think this is a really good point. I wish, or rather I hope, that maybe, we haven't seen it so far, but honestly, hear me out here. What about the Band-Aid? You go and you say, if you institute healthcare institutions, your bureaucracy, rather than just paper, will start consuming medical devices. What about that? How do you feel about this? It could basically be that an institution and its intensity influences what the actual bureaucratic government buildings consume. How about that? I think it could be interesting. It sort of runs against the idea that they have so far when it comes to the topic of buildings mostly changing input and output based on production methods. But I think it could be interesting. I don't know. I don't think it's going to be in the game, but I think that might be interesting. I hope these institutions will be tied to each state, then it develops the institution over time before it has an actual effect. Good point. I'm going to get to that in a second. Legal institutions could be something, varying degrees of accountability and independence with investment into the institution, representing access to centralized law rather than local. I agree, but I also think this is impossible. So there's not just a big difference between local and national law, there's also a big difference between different legal systems in general. We have the civil code that was introduced by Napoleon that is in huge parts of Europe at this point, and even in the colonies in particular, not in the English colonies, of course, or in the former English colonies, but in everything related to, for example, South America. If you look at one of those legal system maps, you will see that there as well. You got common law, you got Germanic law, there are many other legal frameworks as well. But I think that's so niche, never going to be in the game. And I personally, I get, if you say you really want that, but I have to say, I kind of get it. Most people can't, they don't know what any of that means, and like it's not really meaningful to them to begin with. Yeah. Maybe it's because I'm tired, it's 4 AM when I wrote this, you should go to bed, but I'm happy with this dev diary. Also, I would like to have this modifier per states you're talking about. Seems a great idea to counter the bureaucracy problem, who is maybe not a problem. We don't know all the details of the game, perhaps the turmoil mechanic could be part of the answer, I don't know. I think we're gonna get to that in a second again. This is just one of the ones that I put in basically because we're going to take a look at Wiz's response on Twitter. This is looking very good, but I wonder about that Home Affairs institution. By and large, we are talking about law enforcement agencies, and these can be quite vehement in suppressing certain kinds of unrest. But it seems to me that it would be unrealistic for them to be equally effective at suppressing all unrest. If the unrest is more of the counter-revolutionary sort, law enforcement institutions can actually be a part of the problem. So, if the game allows Home Affairs to be too generic a suppressor of trouble, it may lead to ahistorical outcomes. This is an interesting point. I would like to see what people think about this, because I think that this adds a layer of complexity. Could add a layer of complexity. That could be good, but I think also has a lot of potential to not have any meaningful impact. Because basically, this abstraction already makes it so that you need to address the problem there. It basically just says Home Affairs institution includes all of this. I assume that certain Home Affairs, influenced by laws, will be better at certain types of turmoil, but honestly, maybe even feed into administrative efficiency, what we talked about earlier, but honestly, I'm not sure whether actually splitting these up would be beneficial to gameplay. I don't like that teachers, doctors, lawyers, and etc. do not get a single pop to represent them. Besides, bureaucracies just consume paper and are always public jobs. For instance, a private education and health cost bureaucracy, therefore it costs more for the government, even being particular. This is strange. So basically, we talked about the issue of jobs being represented earlier. It's classes that then fulfill jobs rather than jobs that make up classes. In this case, the way it's depicted. Yeah, yeah, I don't know. Private healthcare, I have to assume. I don't know. I agree it's weird. Private healthcare is established via a law and then runs as an institution via your government bureaucrats. I agree that that doesn't really, I mean, kind of weird. Kind of sus, if you forgive me. I can't see anything for border control in the list of planned institutions. I may be understanding the laws institutions things wrong, but should there not be an institution which manages the amount and types of immigration which are allowed into a country? I can think of the US and Japan, for example. I think that this is done basically via law and order and the laws that surround the institution of their home affair. Honestly, I'm not sure though. I highly suspect that border control plays a big role, because the migration that you experience that goes towards America, for example, is of course a big topic in this era. It's a good point. I think that's a good point. What do you folks think about this? We haven't seen it as an institution at all. I can only suspect that it's in a law, but yeah, all laws are generally reflected in institutions here anyway. So I don't know. This makes bureaucracy look like manna, really. I can see the point, the feeling rather. I personally don't agree. I think that institution is so sourced in the reality of bureaucracy is so sourced in the reality of saying we need to administrate something and we need to pay for that with money, and then we need more money to make it so that we have the resources and that we have the manpower. I personally disagree. It's not made out of thin air. It's made out of building pops and then what they produce. But I can see the angle. I want to stress this. I think there's a fine line here to be walked on this topic as well. Don't like the design. The institutions are just same icon times 5 and they are too big. Overall, I find the menus very bland. Fair enough. Wanted to bring that up. But isn't the system like the one where there is the one where... what? But isn't the system like the one where there is always a position that you want to be in with one more X or Y thing? Because I don't see a position where you want to have less bureaucracy to pay for healthcare, for instance, unless you don't want the influence that the interest group give, or there are other more momentary uses for that we haven't seen yet. Well, basically, I mean, it's very important to realize that bureaucracy runs on money. Just like I talked about earlier, bureaucracy fundamentally is financed by your budget. And your budget could go to conquering things, it could go to industry investments, it could go to, trade deals. There's so many different alleys that you could take that, for example, you might not want to build up your bureaucracy because you are insanely interested in the idea of having a trade deal with Japan. For that, you need to increase their relationship with you, or maybe you need to have a little war, classic stuff. The trade-off here does not happen within bureaucracy, although of course you have to choose different institutions as well as you go in different intensities of the institutions. It also happens just with your funding in general, because that funding goes in everywhere. Victoria 2 sourced literally everything to money, and in Victoria 3 it's very similar, to a certain degree at the very least. So I see the point, or I see the argument you're trying to make, but I have to disagree. I think that there's so many different uncertainties, and uncertainties are very important. You can't choose the optimal thing if there are enough uncertainties that make for better options. CK3 does that marvelously. You can invest, and that is really good. It pays off. CK2 didn't do that. CK2's building tall was a general mistake. But in CK3, building tall, building wide, all of these are viable. All of these are strategies that you can have if you want to do them. But you have a trade-off each time you do it. So, basically, I disagree, but I can see where you're coming from. There's something regarding the law enforcement that I have a problem with. From the diary, we see that it only reduces the impact of turmoil in your states. However, what if I have little or no turmoil in your nation? Then law enforcement becomes useless, which I find not really realistic, because law enforcement doesn't just deal with big problems like riots and other mass violence. It also deals with smaller things like theft, bar fights, murder, etc. If law enforcement only helps in reducing the effects of turmoil, then it becomes useless if you create a very stable state, after which, by the dev diary logic, you can just disband your entire national police force, which is just ridiculous if you ask me. I think that law enforcement should also impact the crime rate in your nation and perhaps give a small boost to your pop's wealth, as they won't be robbed in broad daylight like they were when there was no police present at all. This is just my opinion on how the institution could be improved to be more realistic and effective. I like that a lot. I like the idea a lot that there's not just a repressive effect, but also an enhancing effect by saying we just actually guarantee your safety. We're not just here to beat you down. We're also here to say you can go about your business, you don't need to worry. It could just basically be a bonus, right, that gets applied if there, for example, is no turmoil, or if you have a very active police system that that is focused on, for example, having just the reinforcement of societal norms, then, I mean, yeah, sure. I don't see the negative there. Maybe it is already in via different laws. You know, you can have a very repressive law, you can have a very constructive law, but that's something we don't know. I think this is a good point. When do you think the game will come out? I'm thinking November 2021, so I'm pulling this out of my behind. I don't know any more than you do. With how open the developers are to feedback and saying we are considering implementation of this, I suspect Q2, Q3 or Q4 of 2022. My reasoning here is that Paradox has stopped announcing games too early with Hearts of Iron 4. Hearts of Iron 4, if you weren't there for it, was announced in a very different shape that it actually came out in, because they reworked so much stuff. CK3 was announced, and there were two things that were reworked after the announcement. That is the encyclopedia, and that is vassal contracts that were expanded after people were unhappy with the original concept. Victoria 3 talks about implementing parties, maybe implementing different bureaucratic state efficiency. It talks about implementing things such as, there was some other stuff, I forgot about it, but the feeling that I'm getting is that they announced this game earlier than they did CK3 in comparison, for the reason that they need fan feedback, as it is more important here for a game that has so many different expectations and you need to bring them into unison. Then they announced CK3. I think CK3 never changed any of its fundamental directions or mechanics, whereas Victoria 3's team appears to be willing and appears to have the time to do that. So I think we're further away than many of you might enjoy. The thing that is really that this really makes me wonder about is how the game is going to treat religion. Religion in Victoria 2 famously had such a small impact on anything in the game. I really hope it's more impactful as well as modifiable in this. This greater emphasis on religious schools and conversion, as well as some wording in earlier dev diaries, makes it seem like that's the case. Christian India, anyone? So I don't know about Christian India, but I do think that religion should play a role, especially if you play a very religious government, in a similar way to culture. I hope that that is in the game. I agree. It's a good point. Victoria 2 fell short on it. Obviously, it's not the time of crusades or any such nonsense, but it puts you in a position where it is important. And that's it, actually. Alright, what we're going to do next is the dev answers, and then the tweet with Martin Arnold. Alright, here we are. Let's take a look at the dev responses for dev diary number 8. Already a bunch of minutes into this video, but again, you can skip it if you're not interested. That is very interesting. I'm curious whether providing good healthcare will be possible, in fact, only for socialists like in Victoria 2. I plan for autocratic monarchy with public schools and good healthcare. There are a number of different laws that can enable health system institutions, which are supposed by different interest groups. For example, the industrialists support a private health system. See, we talked about this before. I think this is a really good point. It adds flavor. It changes the dynamics that you can have. It is also quite common that institutions enabled under one administration remain after that administration drastically changes, for example, after an election. The new government is on the hook to support the existing institution with its current properties, although they may be inclined to change the laws such that they operate more along their own ideology. Yeah, listen, in Victoria 2, liberals come into power. Your tariffs can't be higher than 0% or, 5%. Then autocrats come into power, your tariffs can be everywhere, right? That's not how it works. You can't just get them into power and then whoop, whoop. It doesn't work that way. Well, that was so ridiculous. In Victoria 3, the way they approach this, I think it is a much more healthier way, where you come to power, unless it's a revolution, you come to power and you go, well, we're stuck with this, we need to change it. And for that we need parliamentary, majorities, we need interest groups majorities, and so on and so forth. So I think that this is the better approach by far. Will none of these institutions cost the government money as well? For example, public schools, social security, hospitals, police, etc. Who is paying for all this? See, I don't get it. How does this have 16 disagrees? Like, listen. You can want, and I think this is a valid position, more specific buildings, but the concept that as it is implemented right now, or will be implemented, doesn't cost you money just means you didn't understand the concept. Seriously. Because the concept literally runs on the idea that you have bureaucracy generated by people in bureaucratic buildings. The buildings cost money, cost construction resources, and then in the buildings you pay wages, you buy resources that can be worked with to produce bureaucracy. It all comes down to money. It just doesn't make any sense to me, man. Are unincorporated states completely useless? No, they produce and consume goods in your market while costing very little to maintain, so no. This is true for both colonies and territory that you conquer that isn't a core territory. I think this might be the only way that administrative efficiency actually really works on the state level, but as it came up a few times, I want to address the feedback that certain institutions, like schools and hospitals, are more suited to being buildings than nationwide institutions. I marked only some stuff here in this text. It's a lot of text, don't worry about it too much. Institutions have an effect on states, and buildings can be scripted to have the same exact effect on states. Institutions having an effect on states does make me wonder whether they are like considering modifiers, but we're going to get to that to a second. So why haven't they done this? They can basically, what he's saying here is, they can translate institutions into buildings. Why haven't they? There are a number of reasons, actually. The foremost of them is that enacting a law is a promise. If the petite bourgeoisie are upset at the lack of police and poor houses to keep the rebel off the streets, they'll be pleased when you enact a law that enables these institutions. And once enabled, you have to pass a law to abolish it, to get rid of it and its administrative costs. If we instead had a police station building and a poor house building, then the PBs, or the petite bourgeoisie, would be pleased once the law that permits you to build them are passed, but you're under no obligation to build and pay for them. This is pretty cheesy and creates a disconnect between the political gameplay and the economic gameplay. This is true if we remain on the level of laws enabling buildings. I basically completely agree with this being a stupid solution if it were implemented like this. Another related aspect is that bureaucracy is intended to discourage sprawl and reward countries who choose to build tall. See, I don't really care that much about this. I think Victoria in itself already encourages building tall. I think that is a fundamental part of the game. This dynamic doesn't work if you can just choose who gets access to how many government services and who doesn't. Yeah, basically they're saying if you blob, you need more bureaucracy. If you, instead of bureaucracy, just have a building system, you don't need more bureaucracy. The last reason, honestly, is the one that I personally agree with the most, and which was my... this is why I don't want these as buildings. The final major reason is the large amounts of frankly boring micro this would require many countries to engage in. I'm telling you right now, in my heart of hearts, I don't believe that you have played Victoria 2 if you unironically think that building infrastructure, for example, in that game was fun. You are out of your mind, either crazy or you've never played the game. It's a huge pain. It's terrible. And actually having to do that in Victoria 3 would have been a terrible choice. It's like they basically would have learned nothing, right? That doesn't mean that we can't go into buildings, that we can't dip into the ideas. And they say that themselves here. They say if the playtests show this, then they can easily just convert institutions into buildings during development. But I gotta tell you, keep the micro away. There's no gameplay purpose of it. Have institutions, for example, instead generate jobs just by virtue of the institution existing. An institution could introduce a certain section of jobs in any given state, for example. Don't have me build things in every state. Don't do this. It's a terrible choice. This leads us to the last section of this overview, which is very long, but hey, that's just how we roll these days. And that is me tweeting Wiz and Wiz responding. Let's take a look at this. Hey Martin Unward, administration is now a purely nationwide resource via bureaucracy in contrast to how it worked in Victoria 2. Will state administration efficiency still exist via state modifiers, so turmoil, that influence the bureaucracy institution effect on a local level? At the moment, we don't have anything like this, but it's being actively discussed in the design team as we do want a reason not to heap all of your government buildings in one state. This is an interesting response because it confirms the worries that I had last video. And I hope that they take it to heart. I'm not saying make it so that I need to micro all of my states. I don't think that is adequate or necessary. But I am saying, please do make it so that states can have a different quality of service that I can deliver regardless of my funding. We debated this earlier with the other comments. We have it right here. I am very much of the opinion that this should be in the game. Because that will lead to a difference between your core territory that you always had and your core territory that you didn't always have. It makes it so that you will have to build, in select spaces rather than spamming it everywhere. You might have to expand your bureaucratic administration rather than having every single bit in Berlin. And Berlin literally runs the German Empire everywhere. It doesn't make sense, right? Yeah, that's my hot take. I think the fact that they're thinking about this means that they have more time to develop it, so they seem to be a bit further back in the development cycle compared to CK3 when it was announced, but also please do think about it. I would love it. I would absolutely love it. And with that, let's actually get to this week's Dev Diary, shall we? So, and here we are. Now we're going to take a look at the Dev Diary number 9, National Markets. Very, very exciting Dev Diary here. There is so much to talk about, both in relation to what this is and in relation to, you know, Victoria too. I think both of those are very important topics here. I have a lot to say, and I hope that you have a lot to say, because just like I did earlier in, like, what, 40 minutes? It's a lot of time, right? But I would like to go through any responses to any feedback that you have, both on my opinions and on how Victoria 3 is looking so far. So, let's take a look at it. Today we will dig into Victoria 3's national market system. Markets are what drives the game's dynamic economy by determining a rational price based on supply and demand for all trade goods in every state throughout the world. Expanding a national market to encompass more territory means more raw resources for your furnaces and more customers for your manufacturing industries. As your industrial base grows, so does your demand for infrastructure to bring goods to the market. So far so good. We've had infrastructure not as a topic on its own, but I think from all the screenshots that we've seen, from all the analysis that we've done, we have a pretty good understanding how market access works. I think this Dev Diary goes into it yet again. The French market is swimming in cheap luxury furniture, porcelain, fruit and meat. Luxury clothes and wine are well balanced, but as far as luxuries go, sugar in particular has a sizable deficit, and securing a reliable source of that would likely result in an improved supply of domestic distilled liquor as well, and liquor is fundamental to Victoria's economy in any Victoria game. By default, every country is in control of its own market, which is typically, but not always, centered on their capital state. Every state connected to this market capital, over land or by seas through ports, is also part of the market. These states all have a variable degree of market access, representing how well connected they are to every other state in the market. Market access is based on infrastructure, which we will talk more about in next week's development diary. I'm very interested in that. I will already say that right now, because obviously it makes a lot of sense. We've talked about market access in the past on this channel when it comes to the Wikinomics panel, for example. But I do think what is interesting to note here is what hasn't been mentioned is whether you need infrastructure through landlocked territory to get landlocked territory to be introduced into your market in a proper way. Of course, that makes sense on a logical level, but it hasn't established yet, so I want to hold back a bit. What I mean is, for example, if you produce something important in Siberia, just because that state has been built up, shouldn't necessarily mean that all of, you know, those goods get to the market and vice versa, because there should be a line from your market center to that location that is actually infrastructure within those provinces. I hope that's the case. I assume that's the case. It just hasn't been clarified, so I did want to bring that up. So next week's Dev Diary is infrastructure, just for the record. All local consumption and production in states contribute to the market, buy orders and sell orders. Think of these as orders on a commodity market. Higher consumption of grain will cause traders to submit more grain buy orders, while higher production of silk will result in more sell orders for silk. If you've ever thought about the market economy that we all live in, or well, I assume most of us live in, then this is basically it. If there's a lot of buyers and not enough sellers, then you have an overhang, you have a surplus of the demand, and the other way around, you would have a surplus of the supply. Furniture is a popular commodity with a growing urban lower middle class, and it is not likely its price in the French market will drop anytime soon. Assuming the appropriate raw materials remain in good supply, upsizing the market's furniture industry is a safe bet. What we have right here is the furniture in the French market. I believe this is where the production sites are. Right here, so these would be the production sites. It looks like it's all the same price in the market. It's one market, I suppose. Here it's a bit cheaper. They produce it as well, it appears. But since this market is... Oh, actually, no, there's a slight difference here. I think this one is slightly higher than that one. But either way, I hope you know where I'm coming from. You see the production right there, and then you see where it can go, because this is part of the market. This is sold by 625 and the buy orders are 1.23k, so many more people want to buy it, which is why this good is expensive. So no matter where you look, except in Belgium, they have enough chairs, I guess, you need to basically produce more to actually have this demand quenched. All goods have a base price. This is the price it would fetch given ideal market conditions. All demand is fulfilled perfectly with available supply, with zero goods produced in excess of demand. If buildings produce more than is being demanded, each unit produced will be sold at a depressed price. So you got the base price, and then on a fundamental level how the market works is if there is not enough supply, it goes up. And if there is enough supply, if there's too much supply, it goes down. That's the depressed price right there. This benefits consumers at the detriment of producers. Conversely, if demand is higher than supply, the economy of buildings producing these goods will become booming, while POPs and buildings that rely on that good to continue operation will be overpaying. When determining prices for goods across a market, many states will start by determining a market price. No, sorry. When determining prices for goods across a market's many states, we start by determining a market price. This is based on the balance between a market buy and sell orders with a base price as a baseline. The more buy orders than sell orders, the higher the price will be, and vice versa. Buy and sell orders submitted to the market are scaled by the amount of market access the state has. This means a state with underdeveloped infrastructure will trade less with the market and rely more on locally available goods. This means that in this local situation, the price even can differ. So basically, I think we just continue here. States with full market access will use the market price for all its goods. Otherwise, only part of the market price can be used, with the remainder of the local price made up by the local consumption and production of the goods. All actual transactions are done in local prices, with market prices acting to moderate local imbalances proportional to market access. So, basically, let's explain this. We can see it right here as well. If you required more, for example, if you don't have full access, if it is dependent on your local production, then you have a situation where the price may rise on that local level. So you got the base price, it can be depressed, it can go high, and then that is the market price wherever it goes, right? This is the general market price, but then you also have a market price that is yet again modified by how much this state actually can access the market, making it then so that in a state the price can be even higher or lower depending on how it goes. Where were we? We were here. Glass is overproduced in Orsha, coupled with a suffering market access in Orsha. This means the glassworks there can't sell at the somewhat high market norm for their goods. This works out fine for local POPs and urban centers, who consume it as they get to pay less than market price. By continuing to expand, the glassworks in Orsha will only lead to worsening market access for all local industries and won't lead to a better price of glass anywhere else, since fewer and fewer of Orsha's glass sell orders end up reaching the market. In this case, very easy to explain. You got the state of Orsha. You have 10 production and only 5 reach the market. The rest, at a lower price, has to be sold at home, right? That's the basic idea there. If you up this to 20, still, only 5 will actually reach the outside. And then 15 will be sold for even cheaper on a local level in Orsha. That's how it works. So, base price, it's adjusted by the market price with the general sell and buy orders. And then you have something that is related to the states themselves based on their market access. We can see this development on the market price chart. The market price used to be high due to low supply. We started expanding the glassworks in Orsha, which lowered the market price until the point Orsha's expanding industry became a bottleneck and prices started to rise again. The last few expansions have done nothing to lower the market price, even as the local price has been steadily dropping. There you go. Yeah, it's basically the local price goes down, but again, you can see it right here, goes up again because the bottleneck in Orsha is rather significant. Yeah, you see the consumption in Orsha, and then you see the market access right there, how it manipulates the price right there. If an oversupply becomes large enough, the selling price will be so low, producers will be unable to keep wages and thereby production volume up, unless they're receiving government subsidies. Of course, you're a company owner, you say, we produce this, you produce too much of it, you can't sell it all, you get all that stuff and it's all wasted. I mean, in this scenario it's wasted, but let's get to that in a second. It's all wasted and we have a situation where you can't keep yourself afloat. You can't pay anyone if you can't, sell the stuff that you produce, meaning you fire them or the state comes in and gives you subsidies. But oversupply is not remotely as bad as when goods are grossly undersupplied, which causes a shortage. Goods being in shortage leads to terrible effects for those in your market who rely on it. For example, drastically decreased production efficiency of buildings that rely on it as an input. Shortages demand immediate action, whether that be fast-tracking expanding your own domestic production, importing it from other markets, or expanding your market to include prominent producers of the goods. Lacking access to a sufficient quantity of dyes, this poor textile mill can only manufacture 42 units of clothes this week instead of 126, which is entirely insufficient to make ends meet. Unless something changes, its wages will be cut to compensate, and eventually cash reserves will run dry, rendering the building inoperable as its workers abandon it. Yeah, we can see that right here, we don't get enough dyes. We produce less of this, meaning that our weekly balance is at minus 1.37k, making it so that we're gonna go bankrupt. If importing dyes, growing them on plantations, or manufacturing them in high-tech chemical plants to fix the shortage is not an option, returning the textile mills to pre-industrial low-yield handcraft will remove the need for dyes and restore the textile mill to marginal profitability. So we produce more But we earn, I mean, obviously, if you actually were in full production here, you would be in a position where your weekly balance would be much, much higher than just 143. But for the moment, 143 is clearly better than minus 1.37k. You can see, interestingly enough, actually, that the infrastructure usage didn't really change. The wages changed slightly. And then, of course, the cost of doing business went down significantly as dyes are no longer necessary, which in turn would also mean that other businesses that need dyes may now actually get more dyes since 15 dyes have been freed up. Astute observers familiar with previous Victorias will note that there are no good stockpiles involved in this system. Keep that in mind. In the predecessor game, a single unit of a good would be produced, sold, traded, perhaps refined, stored, and ultimately consumed, with global price development determined by how many units are inserted into or removed from the world's total supply. In Victoria 3, a single unit of goods is produced and immediately sold at a price determined by how many consumers are willing to buy it at the moment of production. When this happens, prices shift right along with actual supply and demand, and trade between markets is modeled using buy and sell orders. This more open economic model is both more responsive to sudden economic shifts and less prone to mysterious systemic failures where all the world's cement might end up locked inside of a warehouse in Missouri. There was this really interesting Reddit anecdote, and this is something I think that everybody can observe if they play Victoria 2 enough, where somebody built up, I believe it was Myanmar, it was Burma, and Burma bought up everything of a certain class of goods because its population was so middle class wealthy sort of that they had a certain demand, and they just kept buying and buying and buying that up. It also oftentimes happens that the money supply Victoria 2, the money supply literally dries up because it's lying around in somebody, be that a pop or be that a country, and somebody's state bank. And as much as that is a very ambitious attempt of modeling this sort of thing, because it really relies on nothing coming out of thin air, and you produce things, and those things will then be pushed into the actual market eventually. While it does do that, and that is a noble, ambitious goal that I will always support, I personally, and this is I think this is a fundamental thing. I would like to know your opinion on this, basically. I personally have always believed that it's better to have something that isn't as ambitious if it works, compared to something ambitious that is utterly, utterly broken. Victoria 2's economic system, I swear to God, the wind on this changed so heavily. I always stated that it's one of the most broken messes in current Paradox interactive titles, in current Grand Strategy in general. Massively, massively broken in every single way, but highly ambitious. I used to call it, basically, broken dreams and promises, right? Because it looks so good. The idea is so nice, but it just doesn't work. Now, I'm not saying don't be ambitious. I'm not saying Paradox shouldn't be ambitious. I think they should be incredibly ambitious. But if something doesn't work, you have to come back to basically a system that does work. Because otherwise, you're going to have just a broken game. So in that sense, when it comes to the no stockpiling, and when it comes to the idea of the money flow, we're going to get to that in a second, I support stepping away from Victoria 2's system. I don't think it was good. I think it was a decent idea, but the execution was lackluster and probably impossible to actually pull off on that scale. So I personally am a big fan of this, and it is a simplification to a degree, but I'm personally a big fan of having a system that is more robust and works, even if it is a bit simpler, than a system that tries to truly model reality and falls apart if I blow at it. Right? That's where I'm coming from. What's your take on that? I think that is one of the more contentious takes. Any stockpiling in the system is represented as cash, for example, through a building's cash reserves or a country's treasury, or as pop wealth, which forms the basis for standard of living and determines their level of consumption. As the eco-nerds, you know who you are, will know by now, have intuited, this lack of goods stockpiling in turn implies that in Victoria 3 we have moved away from the fixed global money supply introduced in Victoria 2, since this gets converted into treasury. The main reason for this is simply due to how many limitations such a system places on what we can do with the economy in the game. With Victoria 2's extremely restrictive and technically challenging closed market and world market buying order, it simply wouldn't have been possible to do things such as goods substitution, trade routes, dynamic national markets, transportation costs for goods, and so on in the ways we have, either due to the incompatibilities in the design, or simply because it couldn't possibly be made performant. We believe that the complexity, responsive simulation, and interesting gameplay added by this approach more than make up for what we lose. I actually wholeheartedly agree. I have been worried about the economic system for a long, long time about Victoria 3, and not in a sense of like, oh, they're gonna dumb it down. I don't believe that for just even a second. I don't think that has been the approach. Just look at CK3, for example. The way I feel about it was that I feared they would take an approach that was too ambitious and would lead to failure. What they did instead here, if it works, if it actually works, let's assume it does, what they did instead here is they basically introduced a solution that isn't necessarily 100% realistic, because again, the money supply isn't actually something that necessarily makes sense. It just gets converted. There's no storages of these that can later be used up. It just becomes money. I think this solution is adequate from a realism point of view, and far more than adequate from a gameplay point of view. Victoria 2, so many pieces, you blow at them, you touch them, they fall apart. If this hinders the game from being a mess, I am game. Now, they did also confirm that this doesn't mean there will be no economic crises that you may have not seen coming, because these did happen and these do happen in real life, right? But they basically took out the nonsensical stuff like Myanmar, cement in Missouri. You know the drill. What's your take on that? There's a lot of what's your take on that, and there's going to be a big one towards the end of this dev there, because I have a big take on the topic of national markets. Finally, a small teaser of something we will be talking more about once we get around to is presenting the diplomatic gameplay. As you may have gleaned from the top screenshot, it is possible for several countries to participate in a single market. Sometimes this is the result of a customs union pact led by the more powerful nation, but more often it is because of a subject relationship with a puppet or semi-independent colonies. In certain cases, countries can even own a small plot of land inside someone else's market, such as a treaty port. The route to expanding your country's economic power is not only through increasing domestic production and consumption, but also through diplomatic and/or military means. The Zollverein, or German Customs Union, is a broad unified market of German states controlled by Prussia. Without such a union, many smaller German countries would find their economies too inefficient and trade opportunities severely hampered by geography and lack of access to naval trade. That was actually, of course, a huge issue for the German states before the German Customs Union. This was the big step. It's talked about in German history classes in high school, for example, a lot. The topic that we were left, and I mean, Napoleon kind of made it better by making it so that our nations, as they were in the Holy Roman Empire, were significantly consolidated, or rather the states within the German nation. Anyway, the way it was a huge issue for trade. The taxing, the customs within the HRE was awful, and the huge changes made after that in the late 18th and the early to mid 19th century changed how the entire German economy worked. Now, we have an image of this here, and this image had some controversy. We're gonna look at that in a second. I don't think it's that controversial. I think it's interesting to look at nonetheless. These are the fundamentals of Victoria's 3 pricing and domestic trade system. As mentioned, next we will take a look at an aspect of the game that's closely related to markets and pricing infrastructure. I'm very excited about that. I think that should be pretty good. This image is fine, but let's just move on, if I may. Here we go. This is Victoria 2 and its spheres of influence at the game start. You can see that there's already a bit of a difference here. You know, if you look, for example, at Hanover, if you look at the southern German states. Why did I say Hanover? It's clearly Hanover. In general, when I see conversations about the topics of the national markets, it is treated as a direct successor to the spheres of influence. And I agree with that to a certain degree. You can see differences both here. These are not in any influence. They have their own market. That is literally what it means. But the issue that I have when we look at this map is that somebody that may not know German history very well may argue, well, why isn't Saxony, why isn't Bavaria, why isn't Baden and Württemberg and so on, why aren't they in the Austrian market? And the reality is, Austria never joined the Zollverein, but they had political power over these nations. They had proximity, ties on a familial level, and of course political level, as can be seen in the Bruderkrieg, so the German war between Prussia and Austria in 1866. But on an economic level, Saxony in particular, for example, Bavaria as well, were very closely tied to Prussia. That's a fact. So when people say that the national markets are just a successor to the sphere of influence, I hope this is untrue. The way I see this is that I hope Victoria 3 finally properly introduces a difference between diplomacy with minor nations and economic diplomacy with minor nations. When I say diplomacy on its own, what I mean is we assist one another in war. We go in, we do this, we do that. I want this to be a separate system. If you sphere someone, that was both economic, basically vassalization to a degree, and also diplomatic, binding them to you and you binding them to them, you binding yourself to them. And that is not always adequate. Again, this is simply not always adequate, and the best example of this is Saxony, is Bavaria, and so on. Politically incredibly close to Austria, trade-wise close to Prussia. So the way I see it is that I basically want this system to be a successor to spheres, but only a part of the successor. I want more extensive situations when it comes to this on the topic of diplomacy. I want Bavaria to be a part of the Prussian market and yet be politically, diplomatically influenced and even dependent on Austria. That's what I want. I hope that this level is in the diplomacy. I really, really do. Because it wasn't always that clear-cut. Yes, you can absolutely say that Belgium, for example, at the time was diplomatically incredibly tied to the UK. Was it really basically an economic vassal of it? Not really. Not really. And I think that has to be highlighted here. I would like it if there was split. If we basically could see a different differentiation there, that would be interesting. I think that we're going to see that. But we haven't seen diplomacy as its whole yet, so we're gonna take a look at that. I highly suspect that market access will be a part of the diplomatic game, but that diplomacy, classic, genuine, non-aggression pacts, military access, military alliances that actually determine where the politics of the country go, will still, or rather will be an expanded thing. That's where I'm coming from. If this is just spheres of influence, except, basically, this is a Twitter screenshot. Basically, we look at this from a market access, it would be disappointing to me. I think these things need to be split. You need to have market access that can be correlating, that can be caused by political domination of another country. But you could also just have market access because it's a good idea to have a market access. You know, you see it right here. I mean, these are, so basically what we can see here, let's take a look at the screen. People were wondering what these colors mean here. So in the UK, it could mean market access, but I don't think it does. Because if it did, I would suspect parts of Galicia-Volhynia, that's what this is, right? Galicia-Volhynia, I would expect parts of these to basically be colored in a slightly different color as well. I suspect, honestly, that this might just be, I don't know, the mouse pointer? I think that might just be where they hovered the mouse when they took the screenshot, right? But basically, what we see here are the different markets. We can see the Zollverein, we can see Austria, of course, we can see the UK down here, the Ionian Islands, right? We can see Greece, we can see Sicily, we can see the French in their colonies down there, we can see Spain, and Spain includes Gibraltar in their market zone, which is very, very interesting to me. And the other interesting thing here that we should address is the fact that it appears that even if you split a state, it's still very much in a situation where that state belongs to the market that the main section of its state belongs to. We can see that right here. Hanover appears to have this strip here from a different state, and yet it doesn't join the British market. Oldenburg, for example, also joins the British market because this is the province of Hanover, and this isn't. Hanover. Why do I keep pronouncing it like half English, half German? Anyway, I hope you get where I'm coming from. I'm concerned about that. I'm not concerned about the notion of the whether they have this diplomatic and economic game separated but together. You know, I think they will manage that. I have faith. But I'm not that interested in the idea that the market of Hanover, which would clearly be administrated at the border, that market, just because this technically belongs to a different province, to a different state, that actually belongs to that state's market. It doesn't make sense to me. It feels very impactless. If I split a state, yeah, and I get a part of it, is my intention not to add it to my market? It clearly is, right? If I go ahead and, let's say, for example, I divide, I don't know, Belgium, or I divide, I mean, this is a good example here with Nizza, with Nice. It's clear to me that Nice belongs to Sardinia-Piedmont, right? At this point in time. Later on, that will change as the French aid Sardinia-Piedmont to, succeed and to go ahead and to actually form Italy. Nice falls to France. Makes sense. But in 1836, to say because this is gameplay-wise part of the state of, I assume, Nice, maybe Provence, I'm not actually sure. It already belongs to that market. That's a bit weird to me. I don't like that. So I wish splitting states actually had an effect on in which market they are in as well. How do you feel about that? That's my bigger. I also saw a notion, that's of course a good one, that like the internal borders here are a bit weird in places, and yeah, like these shouldn't be connected, but like it doesn't, you know, that's work in progress. At least I hope so. It happens. I'll be honest with you. The map, I'm sure, will be changed and will be altered by like a million times, basically, after the game comes out. That is very typical for grand strategy games. Very typical for CK3, for example, that are now introducing Carantanian culture as well. But basically, my take on these markets is that I believe they are good. I believe thanks to trade deals, we can even have equal markets. We can have customs unions. Yes, of course, the biggest nation dominates them. But a customs union doesn't imply political dependence. The way Victoria 2 depicted this was just really weird. Again, the economic ties to the north were very, very strong, were very, very tight, but the political ties to Austria were. Now, Victoria 2 didn't have a difference there. If you had somebody sphered, that meant political dependence, but it also meant economic dependence, because they joined your market and you had the right to purchase their goods first, which historically was never the case. Bavaria was later, was a part of the... Actually, when the hell did we join? I think we were already apart in 1836. I think Baden joined in like 1837. That's what I was thinking about here. Anyway, I hope you know where I'm coming from. I believe that the system in Victoria 2 of spheres of influence, I mean, it was cumbersome, but let's put that aside. I believe that it didn't depict reality because it always connected political dependence with economic dependence. And that's not always the case. Yes, you have a strongest force, which is Prussia in this market, but that doesn't mean that Bavaria is basically a vassal or, you know, a small friend of Prussia. They, politically speaking, were closer to Austria, similar to Saxony. And I really, really just hope that this does indeed mean that basically they separated the economic and the diplomatic layer. Now, they do belong together and they should interact with one another, but on a fundamental level, they do not necessitate one another. Yeah, and that's basically my take on that. I know that this deviates a bit, because I just personally don't think that they just, this isn't just the new spheres of influences. I think they split it up. I think they add more quality and more variety to it. And that's what I'm there for. Beyond that, I mean, you can see right here where the capital of the market is. Of course, here it's Berlin. Right here it's Vienna. Here it is, what is it? Zurich, Bern? Honestly, I don't know the, I don't know anything about the geography of Switzerland. My apology, dear Swiss folks. Anyway, this is quite interesting. I think these menus are fine. The map I'm still not entirely sold on. Even initially I was, I don't know, just like, without any trees and whatnot. CK3 is the same problem. CK3, if you zoom out too far, you get to this tapestry sort of thing, where it shows you everything colored in one color, and it looks ugly. But if you take that color away and just leave that zoom level of terrain, it also looks ugly because there's not enough detail. This just doesn't have enough detail for me to look interesting, but maybe it looks different in-game. I do remember vividly from CK3 the portraits looking so bad until they showed them animated. Once you saw the animations and them in, you know, basically their live environment, it was significantly better. It was just significantly better. Yeah, basically you can see the market access right here, and then the production and consumption in Orsha itself. That's what sets the price. Quite nice. I actually do like that a lot. Again, you see the difference there, the general Russian market price. You see how it's sold in Orsha itself. Good stuff. I personally like the base price setting, then the flexibility that comes in with the market, and then the market access setting it for the state level. I'm very happy about the market, the way it works. I think that the confidence that I can have in this system working compared to Victoria 2's broken system is much, much higher, and I'm going to end it here. Let me know what you have in terms of input. In particular, I'm very interested in my points made about the spheres of influence versus saying market and politics can be united, but they don't have to. Right? This doesn't have to be an top-down relationship. You can have just Sweden going ahead basically and saying we as the Swedish market have a trade deal with the Prussian market, and that gives us limited access to one another, which could, hey, this is a super interesting stuff. You can gain tariffs there. You can have the cost of transport, the cost of the tariffs in there as well. Of course, we already can see some trade notes here from the looks of it. I'm very, very interested in seeing that as well. Honestly, there's so much that I would like to learn more about, but in general, when it comes to the economic depiction that they have here, I have the utmost confidence that they're actually pulling off a game that doesn't crash the economy whenever something stupid happens. Alright, and with that being said, let me know in the comments. We're gonna do a general comment and dev response review in the next video about this dev diary. Let me know about your comments, and we're gonna go check it out. Yeah,